Welcome to Ballot Battleground, Nevada. I'm your host, Ben Marjat, a reporter at KRNV News 4 in Reno. I'm passionate about making politics in this critical battleground state more digestible to the average voter and pushing past the talking points to press politicians for answers. On this show, we take deep dives into the people, ideas, and debates shaping Silver State politics. Late nights, filibusters, and political gamesmanship. The end of the 2025 session of the Nevada legislature had all the usual shenanigans we've come to expect in the mad dash to the finish. It can be a little difficult to tell what exactly has happened when we're in the thick of it with so much going on. So, this episode, what happened, which bills lived and died, and why? And what does it all mean? We'll hone in on the final chaotic hours with our reporter Sophie Lincoln, who is our boots on the ground for day 120, and a little later we'll zoom out to examine the bigger picture with political analyst and TMCC political science professor Fred Lokken. Lokken and I chat about how the session will affect Nevadans' lives and what it means for the 2026 midterms. We've got a great show for you this week, so let's dive right in. Sophie Lincoln joining us now in studio, News 4, Fox 11 reporter. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always a good time to be on the podcast.
Yeah, making time for us. She's got a whole nother story today, but she's doing the podcast today, so we really appreciate it. Your first Nevada legislative session is in the books, and probably your first legislative session as a reporter, right?
Yeah.
What did you think? What did you make of it all?
Yeah, it was a very interesting experience, especially because Nevada does have a weird legislative system that we talked about, but definitely a good experience for me. Kind of the consensus I got overall from lawmakers at the end was that this was a really productive session, and people were able to kind of compromise. So, I think it went great. Hopefully avoided a special session.
You were there on day 120, I should say night 120, because I kind of handed it off to you. Mm-hmm. You took over our coverage for News 4 and Fox 11, did a great job that evening. Take us, behind the scenes a little bit as you're reporting that evening, probably running back and forth between Assembly and Senate chambers. There's so much going on. Just set the scene for us, if you will. What's happening in the final hours of the session?
Definitely the final hours. And I would even say the final, less than an hour was kind of the most action-packed of that entire day. Definitely lots going on in that little press room. We were all watching several videos of, different committees and the Assembly and the Senate. And a lot happened, as I'm sure we'll talk about in a second here, within kind of the 11th hour there. So lots of big bills that we were like, is this going to be heard in both houses? Are we going to end on time? Are we going to need to go into a special session? So definitely a busy last hour there.
Yeah. And we'll get into kind of which bills lived and died and whatnot. But walk me through kind of the end, right? Because if you go to the legislature's website right now, it says that the legislature adjourned sine die at 12:35 a.m. on June 3rd. And people might be like, wait, I thought they were supposed to end on June 2nd. That went beyond midnight. The Constitution says, we have until day 120. So what happened? How were they able to kind of go, according to the website, 35 minutes after? What caused that to happen? Why was that allowed?
Yeah, so that was a surprise to me as well. I was in the Senate chambers as I was expecting them to wrap up, but there was kind of this last minute kind of shenanigans happening. I know it. I don't want to call it necessarily that because I know that there was good reasoning behind it on both sides, but there were a couple of motions left, and it did seem to me, my theory was that there were certain senators that were trying to run out the clock. Sure. So Senator Ira Hansen kept kind of interrupting the motion and saying, let's redo this. And at that point, it's 11:59. And so I'm thinking they're not going to get through the motion and it's going to end because, as you mentioned, in the Nevada Constitution, it says you have to adjourn by midnight. But then there was discussion over, Majority Leader Nicole Cannizzaro was saying, we started a motion, we can finish it, even though it is now past sine die. And there was a lot of conversation over that across party lines. Ultimately, they had legal counsel come, and
Wow.
the decision they ultimately came to was that they could finish that motion, but there was kind of like a hiatus there where, Stavros Anthony was talking with the legal counsel, and they were all kind of going back and forth on what they were allowed to do. Ultimately, Minority Leader Robin Titus made a statement, and she kind of explained why this was happening. It was all over a Senate resolution, and she had kind of explained that within the last half hour before sine die, there were these new stipulations that she claimed she was not aware of until then that would basically affect the representation of both parties in the legislative committee for the next
the
session.
commission. Yeah.
Yeah. These new stipulations made it so that they didn't have to have equal representation from, because there's kind of a super majority, and it got rid of kind of a rule there that said that they would need to have equal representation from the minority party as well. And so that's kind of where Senator Titus and Senator Hansen were trying to put off that motion because they felt that wasn't fair. Ultimately, Senator Titus said, we're going to go ahead and we are going to agree to vote on this motion, but here's why all of this happened. So
as of now, it doesn't look like there's going to be a special session imminently. Folks have talked about a special session in the fall once the federal government's budget is approved, and if that has major ramifications for Nevada's state budget, they might have a special session then. But for now, no immediate special session. For a minute, though, it looked like there might have to be one because of the capital improvement projects budget, which is one of the 5 major budget bills that the legislature is constitutionally required to pass. And that one's kind of unique because it has this requirement that 2/3 of the legislature must support it. And so walk us through what happened with the CIP, capital improvement projects bill, why it was believed that there could have to be a special session for that measure.
Yeah, that was another thing that happened in the 11th hour of the legislature. And what had happened was the Assembly had proposed amendments to it. And the Senate was basically saying, we already passed, the version that we want it to see go through. We're not going to accept these amendments. And so I would say it was probably about 11:30 on that last night of the legislature. The Assembly actually decided to withdraw those amendments and basically go back to the original version that the Senate passed, and they were able to avoid a special session that way. But yeah, there was, I kept waiting, at like 11:30. I'm like, if they don't pass this, there will be a special session. And I had kind of heard rumors in the press room that the Assembly was going to withdraw those amendments just to avoid that special session. And ultimately they did do that. But at the last moment.
In the final, literally, minutes of the session. Wow. And then what happened with the governor's crime bill? He had this major legislation that came, really, we only got the language of it, of this Safe Streets and Neighborhoods Act, 10 days, or it might have even been less. I think it was less than 10 days, 5, 6, 7 days from the end of the session that they had the first bill hearing. It was 6 hours long. Criminal justice advocates, ACLU, et cetera, had many issues with it. It was starting to be amended. I believe it passed through one chamber, ultimately failed, did not make it to Lombardo's desk. What can you tell us about what happened with that measure?
So that one, as you mentioned, was a bit controversial. It was proposing some pretty major changes to the way that the state handles different felonies. For instance, there was, they wanted to raise the felony theft threshold from...
Or lower it, yeah.
Or lower it. Yeah. I think it was...
From like 1,200
down to like 750, which is pretty low. And there were studies that were saying, this would lead to hundreds of more inmates in state prisons, which would, of course, cost the state a lot more money. So that was one concern. Ultimately, one of the houses, I'm trying to remember, I think it was the assembly, but don't quote me on that.
Sure.
They got rid of that and, kind of watered down the bill. But as you mentioned, it never actually made it to its second house for passage there just because, it was one of those ones that we were waiting on at the last minute, and it, it was in its committee. It went back to the committee for after they had made those amendments, but it ultimately never made it to the second house.
Wrapping up here on a personal note, you were down at the legislature probably, 15, 20, maybe 30 times throughout the session. Maybe not 30, but a lot. What was, your personal highlight? What was your kind of favorite moment of being in the legislative building, seeing this process in action?
Yeah, good question. I really liked covering the legislature. It's really interesting to get into more local state politics and see like how this all actually works, especially because Nevada does have a unique system. Honestly, I think one of my highlights wasn't actually strictly legislature coverage, but we did this women's special for National or International Women's Day. And I got the legislature is led by a majority of females. So I got to speak with, Majority Leader Nicole Cannizzaro, Minority Leader Senator Titus, and just hearing about like their personal stories and how they got to be where they are, doing that female leading the legislature type coverage was really cool for me. So
that was a great story. Yeah, first in the nation.
Yeah.
To have a majority-led legislature. So pretty cool fact and honor that Nevada has. So Sophie Lincoln, thank you so much for your coverage throughout the session and also for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We'll let you get back to your regular story.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
A special thanks to Sophie Lincoln for her coverage at the end of the session and for joining us this week. Now for the bigger picture, what this all means in the grand scheme of things, let's get to our conversation with TMCC professor and the chair of the Political Science Department, Fred Lokken. Fred Lokken joining us in studio now. Fred, the very first guest of this podcast early last year. I can't believe it that you are back here, and we've done, 50 or 60 episodes since then. And Fred Lokken, the truest Ballot Battleground Nevada diehard fans know him from episode 1. But it's a pleasure to have you.
Well, it was an honor and a pleasure to do that. And I've been sitting by my phone ever since. Finally rang, and so I'm very happy to be back.
Well, and we should say too, you were since it was the first episode, you were so heavily featured in our promotional materials that apparently we're talking off mic here. Some people think you're the host of this show. Is that right?
Yes, they do, and I quickly correct that. Some people would perpetuate that myth, but no, I'm very proud that you are the host of the program, but apparently they have the sound down and just kept seeing me in that ad. So I am someone who's approached constantly, and it's okay. So I just can't get enough of that. I think people really want to talk about politics.
So do you want to take over here? You want to host the rest of the interview here?
You're doing
fine.
Ask
the question. I'm just kidding. No, that's hilarious. Well, thank you so much. You're always so willing to come and chat with us and give us some of your valuable insight. And today, of course, we are talking about the Nevada legislature. You, of course, are a careful observer of it, given your role as the political science professor and chair of that department at TMCC. What do you make of how it all went down at the end? People who watch the legislative sessions over the last, many years know that it can be kind of chaotic. Was this kind of what you tend to expect and see? What was your reaction to just how the session came to a close?
Well, this was personally my 17th session to observe as a political scientist, coming from Wisconsin originally, where there's a full-time legislature, where there's a larger population, a longer history. And so it was very interesting to come to the West and to see this notion of a part-time legislature only there for a fixed time, not really paying our legislators not much really. There's sort of a built-in disrespect for government in the West, whereas in the East we trust it more. Every one of the 17 sessions has its own personality. It's really hard to often talk about trends in Nevada just because it's driven by the personalities of the leadership. Certainly the governor matters in terms of what the discussions and priorities are going to be, how this session is going to be approached from the executive branch, where we are economically, because we have had a very unpredictable economy in Nevada as we've grown up, and that often throws the entire session into a tizzy. So this one has all of those characteristics, but it was different in the sense of how it began, which was with an error by the governor's office that created a $300 million hole in the budget, and then a process of policies, 5 policy bills dropping, the latest I've ever seen them drop into the legislative session.
Right. And
then not really knowing where we were fiscally, and everything kind of blowing up at the end with a filibuster that had nothing to do with that, but dated over to the Legislative Advisory Council, which just showed how much politics was a part of this session.
Absolutely. And we're kind of used to seeing this mad dash to the finish, so to speak, in the final hours, but this one actually extending beyond midnight, which we talked about earlier in this episode with my colleague, Sophie Lincoln. What's the most consequential bill or thing that happened out of this 2025 legislative session when you kind of zoom out now and look at it in totality?
If you talk to the legislators, to those who visit the facility, to the lobbyists, finishing the major part of the reconstruction and having a decent cafe was monumental. It was a discussion for a very long period of time.
It was very tasty. Yes,
the shoebox that had been there for years. It is the topic that people still go to. They love it. But I think there were some compromises towards the end that were refreshing to see. We've been feeling the bipartisanship in Nevada politics in our purple status. And it was nice to see that you could find some of the governor's bills that got jettisoned, that you could find some middle ground and see them come back. And I think the most consequential reality was the change from an economic forum forecast of growth to an economic forum of being guarded.
Sure.
And so we got the budget through, but I think everyone is sort of anticipating a special session this fall.
Absolutely. What do you make of the film tax credit proposal that, there was kind of 2 competing proposals expanding Nevada's film tax credit significantly? They tried to merge those into one bill at the end, and ultimately it didn't make it through. I think if you had asked me prior to the session, I would have said that was likely to pass, and ultimately, evidently, not enough support in the building for that. What did you make of that?
Well, to begin with, because of the price tag attached, it became suddenly a very tight budget. And when there was wiggle room with anticipated growth, that was one thing. Also, the fact that there were competing bills and production companies, that did not help. And then I think the third factor is that we are looking out and seeing the death of Hollywood in California. And a lot of states are now out there competing. And I know that there were those in the legislature that felt that they might be being played on this issue, and was there going to be the return for investment where we were really going to get out what we had put into it. As you well know, the controversies over funding first the Allegiant Stadium, and then coming up with money for the new baseball stadium and other things like that have really brought a lot of citizens into the conversation that don't feel we should be subsidizing. And I think that's nudged the culture a bit and just saw it pulled back. There's something that makes sense about this relationship, and we have a lot of Hollywood in Nevada historically. But I think another 2 years of maybe some good behind-the-scenes work will maybe get this across the finish line in 27. And it's not uncommon for things to come back and come back until the timing is right.
Of course, yeah. And in 2023, that film tax credit program was brought up and mentioned. It got pushed to 2025, and who knows, maybe back again in 2 years. As we look at the session in totality here and what the governor was able to accomplish and not accomplish, do you think in broad strokes that he was able to accomplish what he set out to do and can go to voters as, the midterms are right around the corner and say, I did X, Y, and Z in this session? Or, the high profile one, his crime bill not making it through, does that make it harder for him to say, I went out and accomplished what I could given the democratically controlled legislature?
Well, both Democrats and Republicans will find very creative way to how they spin the results of this session and the other session, because both sessions will be factors in the election of 2026. It's very difficult when we have divided government in Nevada, which we wound up with. I've always argued that, and it's no disrespect to Governor Lombardo, but many of our voters were very dissatisfied with the Sisolak administration and the entire burden of the pandemic.
Sure.
To Sisolak's credit, he got us through it, and nobody gave him a manual about how to do it. But there was a high level of frustration. And we've had elections in the past few decades where it's not that somebody wins, but somebody loses. And that was all on Sisolak. His campaign was a non-starter for re-election, and I think it pulled down the Democratic Party and it opened the door for the Republicans to win. So 26 will be an opportunity to see if we're still in that situation, or if the Democratic candidates will actually create a race. But aside from that, it's a mixed bag, I think, for the governor because of the divided government. It's close to a 2/3 majority in both chambers. And so short of actually finding middle ground that's going to make moderate policy, a number of his policies were going to be too far to the right for the Democratic majority, and they were going to have an uphill battle. So he had a mixed bag of what he was able to accomplish. 4 of the 5 policies died in the session, I think because of the timing of their introduction. There's no appetite for a special session right now, and I think the special session coming will be all budget. So he's going to have to run on what he's accomplished, and we'll see what happens.
Anything that stands out to you in terms of bills that he's signed or vetoed at this point? And obviously this is still in flux because there are still, as of this recording, about 200 bills left in his office awaiting his signature veto. But any that stand out as interesting or surprising, things that you would have expected to go a different way?
Well, I'll say that the number of vetoes, we had a record-breaking 77 in the first session, and these do seem to be accumulating as of airtime for this, probably 200 bills still on his desk that he needs to pass judgment on. And under the circumstances, I would argue as a political scientist that vetoes always represent a failure politically. The more you have, Jim Gibbons was legendary for issuing quite a few. There was the first Ryan Sandoval had a rather large number, found that compromise worked a lot better. When you can find the middle ground, you don't have nearly as many vetoes. And I think that struck me that there could have been more presence, I think, in the hallways, more efforts in the offices of trying to find where the middle is instead of reminding each other of where the ends are. The thing that really surprises me is the veto again of the bill that would have penalized fake electors for the Electoral College. There's no way to put lipstick on that one. It feels like it's more of an agenda elsewhere than in the state of Nevada. But what they did is, in my view, not legal, and it was also unethical, and it was a serious challenge here and in other states. And Nevada has not addressed that problem, and in the absence of doing it, it could happen again.
Fascinating. Yeah, that is one that we have focused on, but should try and ask him about very soon. The next time that we get the chance, we have many questions for him regarding certain vetoes and bills that he signed. Any last takeaways or things that just, as again, I've used this phrase a couple times now, but zoom out now that the dust has kind of settled a little bit, that just stood out to you? Any observations or analysis that you can give to us here before we sign off?
Well, I think that in Nevada, we do have that purple state status with divided government, and it was very present in this session. In the last session, it's Brian Sandoval was the last one to successfully maneuver through it. And it's very problematic because we really were seeing some ideas tested for the 2026 election. I don't think voters really like how long this stuff is taking now in our state. I think we'd like, shorter campaign periods and legislative sessions that are effective and get the work done. One thing that people don't follow is we used to produce 600 bills that were signed by the governor. During this administration, we've dropped to 400 for each. Well, we'll see where we wind up with the most recent session. But they only have the one shot every 2 years, and there are a lot of problems that can be addressed. And what problems aren't being addressed as a result? I'm concerned about that, and kind of hope that the parties can get past the politics and find ways to govern together.
All right, Fred Lokken, the first guest and now the most recent guest of Ballot Battleground Nevada. Thank you so much for making the time. We appreciate it. Enjoy your summer of teaching and, most importantly, your sabbatical in the fall. Enjoy that very much. Thanks for giving us some time today.
Thank you. Best of luck, Ben.
If you made it to the end of this episode, I really appreciate it. If you have guest ideas, episode ideas, questions, comments, compliments, concerns, anything at all, feel free to shoot us an email. I'd love to hear from you. My email is bjmargiot, MARGIOTT, @sbgtv.com, and put Ballot Battleground Nevada in the subject line. And if you have a minute, I'd really appreciate it if you left a rating and a review. That helps the podcast show up higher in searches so more people can discover Ballot Battleground Nevada. Thanks for listening.